Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. So today we will be discussing about materials, metals and non-metals, which is chapter 4 of class 8 science. So when you think about the word material, what comes into your mind first? There are a wide variety of materials around us, right? For example, very common will be the plastic or the iron, aluminium, which we usually use on our day-to-day basis. So according to their properties, what we see, we could categorize them into metals and non-metals. Anyone can do that. Am I right? So in this chapter, we are going to deal with that. First will be physical properties of metals and non-metals. We'll be dealing with both. And the second one is chemical property. So in this chapter, we are going to deal with both of this, physical properties and chemical properties of metals and non-metals. So we will see their properties, and also we'll do some exercises that last. Okay, so let us begin the chapter. So before we begin the chapter, let me give you a brief explanation about material. Like, what are materials? You know that there are a wide variety of substances which are found in nature, right? So we can categorize them into natural and artificial or man-made. So there are two types of material, natural and artificial or man-made materials. So what is a natural materials or natural substance? We could say that these are, as the name suggests, which are found in nature, like naturally occurring material. These are the naturally occurring materials. For example, coal, petroleum. So these are naturally occurring substances or materials. So these natural occurring substance or material can further be divided into two, that are metals and non-metals. So what about artificial or man-made materials? These are not found in nature, or these are, as the name suggests, man-made materials. For example, we could say table, chair, pen, pencil, etc. Everything which are artificially made. So that is natural or artificial or man-made substances. So now we will see about what are metal, which is the first classification of naturally occurring material. What are metals? So a simple definition for metals would be those materials which possess the characteristics of being hard, shiny, malleable, ductile, etc. are termed as metal. This is a simple definition for what are metals. What are the examples? That will be very common example is iron, which is very naturally occurring element. Next one will be gold, which you're very familiar with. Next will be silver, aluminium. These are very common examples of metals. Now let us see the physical property of metal. We'll be dealing with that first. So by this name, what we could identify is that the physical property is which we come to know by just touching, seeing, or by looking at its color. The first physical property is malleable. What is this property? It is that property of metal which allows them to be beaten into thin sheets. Due to presence of this property, the shape of iron nail and aluminium wire can be changed on beating. The very common example is aluminium foil, which we use in the kitchen. We use it for wide variety of purposes, for wrapping food materials, etc., etc. We use it very common. These are very thin sheets which has changed from aluminium to aluminium foil. So that is a physical property which we can see. So what are other example? Copper. Copper is another example which can be beaten into thin sheets, and very high malleable metals are gold and silver. This we could see because mostly these are used for jewelry. So we come across it on day-to-day basis, right? So these are very highly malleable substances. Now, what is the second property? Second property will be conductivity. So what is conductivity? It is that property of metal which allow the current and heat to pass through them easily, which allow current and as well as heat and heat. They allow both current and heat to pass through them. So very common example is iron itself, or iron rod can be taken as a good example. This allow easy passage of current as well as heat. Or next example is copper wire, which is widely used for wiring purposes. It also allows current and heat to pass through them. That's why it is used for electrical purposes. So these are good conductors of electricity. The third property is ductility. So what is ductility? It is a property of metals which allow them to be drawn into wires. Like for example, metals like aluminium, copper, these are drawn into wires. You have seen already this copper wires or aluminium wires which are used for electric connection purposes. So these are ductile materials. And very common example would be gold or silver. We see gold and silver jewelry which are drawn into wire, like chains example. So these gold or silver chains are also a good example for a ductile metal. Fourth property is sonorous. What is this sonorous property? It is the property of metal which produces ringing sound on hitting. Like ringing property of metals depend on the temperature and density. So it depends on temperature and density. So for example will be commonly seen bells, which in schools and all we usually see bells. Metals have sonorous property, and this ringing sound produced by metal is known as sonority. So these bells are made of metals. The next property would be lustrous. So what is this lustrous property? It is the property of metal which make them shine, and their structures are capable of reflecting incident light. So these are very shiny property. Main example would be gold itself. Gold, silver, copper, platinum. These are main examples because these have very shiny appearance. So gold, silver, platinum are used for jewelry, and copper is also very much shiny, as these reflect the light which falls on them. Sixth property, that is hardness. So what is this hardness property? Because of this malleability and ductility property of metals, these metals are very strong in nature. So hardness definitely indicate the strength or strong metals. And some of these metals which are having non-ductile and non-malleable property are not so strong. The example would be iron itself. Iron is very much good example for a hard or a strong metal. Seventh property is solid at room temperature. So we know that these metals are very much solid in nature at room temperature. Although there may be some exceptions like mercury or gallium. Mercury and gallium are exceptions, because these you might have seen mercury very commonly, which are used in the chemistry labs. These are liquid state. These are in liquid state. Although most of the metals are solid at room temperature, with exceptions of these two metals. Next property is high melting point. High melting and boiling point. So most of the metals have high melting and boiling point. The metals which are solid in nature always have high melting and boiling point because they are closely packed and high attraction. Here also there are very much exceptions, like for example sodium, potassium, mercury, gallium. So these are having very low melting and boiling point. All metals have very high melting and boiling point. Take in the case of iron, we have to melt it at very high temperature for so long for it to melt. Exceptions are these four. The last property is high tensile strength. So what is it? The metals which can bear the strain are termed as high tensile strength metals. So example is iron. If you take, it is having a very high tensile strength. It can be bent to, the strain can be applied to a large extent that it does not break. So that is, it has a high tensile strength. Here also we have a few exceptions, like metals zinc, arsenic, antimony. These have very low tensile strength, so these break very easily. So these three are the exceptions. So by this we conclude the physical properties of metals. So although we have many other properties for class 8th, we just have to study only this much. So these are the 9 physical properties, and in the next part we will see the physical properties of non-metals, and in the coming parts we will see the chemical properties of metals and non-metals, etc., and we will do the exercises also. Thank you so much.